Thank you, Professor Goodman, for joining us. Can you give us your analysis on Mor Nevuchim 1-2, including your comparing and contrasting between the Rambam and Nietzsche regarding the nature of values and value judgments?
That's a wonderful question. Let me tell you what I think about that, because there are a lot of people, even today, serious scholars, who have gotten a wrong impression of what's happening in that passage. And I'll, without going into who, what, where, why, when, I can tell you that they've been misled by the notion that Rambam is worrying about the fact-value dichotomy, and they've been misled into thinking that he represents a kind of value relativism. That's exactly the position that he is rejecting. But let's start out very straightforwardly. He opens chapter 2 of the guide by saying that there was a knowledgeable person who raised a kind of objection to the story about Adam and Eve and the creation in Bereshit. The objection was this. The Torah seems to tell us that Adam and Eve received by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they received an understanding which in fact is reality's, is mankind's highest distinction. And the objector who raised this point said it was like some of those myths, and he skirts relating the myths, but the kind of myths where somebody does something really terrible and gets made into a constellation in the sky. Thinking about stories like the Titans, like Orion gets made into a constellation because he was a rebel against the Olympian gods. And the Rambam says that that's too casual a reading of the story. And you have to recognize that when Rambam reads the story of that first couple, Adam and Chava, that he doesn't think that this is a description of a literal event that happened historically. He does think that there was a first couple. He says so later in the guide. But he doesn't think that the story about eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was something that happened. He thinks that it's meant to characterize the human condition. In what sense? Well, he doesn't think that we got our knowledge of good and evil from eating the fruit. The first thing to recognize, which he doesn't bother saying, is that knowledge doesn't come on trees. It doesn't grow on trees. That's not how we get to know things. And in fact, like the rabbis in the Talmud, he believes that the knowledge of right and wrong was there from the beginning. And his argument for that, and he always has an argument, is that if we didn't know the difference between right and wrong, we wouldn't be subject to mitzvot. The animals don't get commandments, they don't get precepts, and he likes to use an Arabic word that means precepts for the commandments, wasiyat, because they wouldn't understand it and they're not morally responsible. You've got to have reason, and he doesn't think the animals have reason. If you have reason, that makes you subject to the mitzvot. And that's what Kant will say, centuries later. Adam and Eve got mitzvot. They were told not to touch this particular tree. That's a significant restraint on their appetites, and they ought to be able to understand and accept that you can order animals around, but you can't really give them precepts like that. So the Talmud believes that Adam and Eve knew about right and wrong before eating the tree, the fruit of the tree. It actually says the tree. What was the problem then? I think the problem begins with the fact that the serpent, being a serpent, spoke with forked tongue. That's what serpents do. What was the forked tongue? Two different meanings in what the serpent said. The serpent said that you will be like Elohim. Now that could mean you will be like God. Elohim is the regular word for God, but it's in plural in form. And Rambam makes a point of saying that in this particular context, it means you will be like rulers. What kind of rulers? You will be like arbiters. What kind of arbiters? Arbiters of right and wrong. So when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, what happened to them really was not a change of their mind. It was a change of their outlook. They thought that they were adequate deciders of what was right and wrong. And that's a representation not of an event, which is a fall, as Christian theology interprets it. It's not an event which created an inherited sin. What it is a characterization of the human condition. How so? Because we have the judgment to know the difference between right and wrong, but we jump to the conclusion that having that judgment makes us capable of deciding that whatever we wanted is right and wrong. That's where Nietzsche comes in. Nietzsche has the idea that we have to become godlike, much like what the serpent said. We have to create our own values, and what creates values? The fact that I chose it. If I chose it and I really meant to choose it and I would do it again in Nietzsche's philosophy, that shows that I was right, and there's no further test of right and wrong. Whereas Rambam is a moral realist. That means he thinks there's an objective difference between right and wrong. But Eve notices that the fruit is attractive and it looks delicious. And what happens is that she gets carried away by her senses, and she gets carried away by her passions, where imagination expands and enlarges the appetites that we have. And then he points out that one of the things which confounds our moral judgment is convention. And that's also represented in the story. How so? Because Adam and Eve weren't bothered by the fact that they were naked before they ate the apple. But then the excuse that they give, well, where were you? What happened? I was afraid to come out because I was naked. All of a sudden, they're concerned with being naked. And the Rambam makes the point that being worried about being naked is a matter of convention. Now, he doesn't, like some people today, think that if something is conventional, like gender, that means it's non-existent. He thinks convention matters. However, convention is not the same as moral difference. I can tell you, I had anthropologist friends who worked in Guatemala. You know, in the convention there, the women went topless in this tribal society, but they were scandalized that the anthropologist's wife, who was herself an anthropologist, wore shorts. She was showing her legs. They thought it was perfectly fine to show your breasts, but oh my goodness, showing your legs, that's, as Rambam makes the point that nakedness and worry about nakedness is a matter of convention. And these three things, appetite, passion, and convention, skew human moral judgment. We had the judgment to start with, and we get the idea of convention, and that really comes from thinking that whatever we want is fine because it's what we want. That's where his moral realism kicks in. He's saying, look, you have reason, which is perfectly capable of telling you what's right and what's wrong. The passage in chapter 2 of part 1 makes a distinction between truth and value judgments, but it's not the Humean distinction of what's true is objective and what's right and wrong is subjective. That's not the point at all. The point that it's making is that when you start thinking it's subjective, when you start thinking your outlook and your attitude controls, then you are falling away from what reason teaches you, and what Hashem has instructed you to be and what you can become. Notice, please, the role of imagination there, because imagination takes those appetites and passions and conventions and elevates them to a higher plane than they deserve. That's why he'll say later on in the guide that imagination is the true Yetzer Hara, it's the true evil inclination, because it projects those things. So when you talk about the snake and you talk about the Satan and so forth, he's always thinking that that refers to imagination. And that leads to a very interesting problem, which I think we should get to later, which is imagination is also the distinctive mark that makes the difference between a prophet and a philosopher. A prophet, in the Rambam's view, is a philosopher who has the imagination to put his ideas across. So just as matter has a beneficial role and a deleterious role, imagination has a constructive and creative role in prophecy, for example, but it also has a nasty role, a role where it's operating as what is symbolically represented as the serpent. Does that help?
Very much.
Yes. I'm just, so if I'm understanding you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong over here, with reason, there's not much that can go wrong. But once it gets sunk into conventionalities, there is a lot of human interjections that can come in and projections, and it can start to derail our human morality.
Yeah, and you could put reason in the service of those projections. You could use reason in behalf of the. It's not just convention. It's the senses and the passions and conventions, and that skews your moral judgment. And it also gives you the illusion that whatever you decided is right. That's where the Nietzsche thing comes in, right? I am the arbiter of right and wrong, good and evil. No, we're not. There's an objective. There are moral facts, and there are things which are objectively right and wrong. Whether you're naked or not, that is a matter of convention. Whether that matters, it depends on the conventions in your society. And by the way, all societies have conventions about nakedness, and Rambam is fine with that. He doesn't think that you should become a nudist or something like that. But those conventions have a function in a society, in a culture, when people get carried away with that kind of thing, you can see a lot of that in what's politically correct today. It used to be conventional that relationships between the sexes were done in a certain way. The convention is they're done in a different way. The conventions change the right and wrong about how you treat your partner. That's not a matter of convention. The fact that, I'll give you another example. It comes from Sadja, great philosophical predecessor of Rambam's. It's an objective fact that you should be grateful to God. God created us, gave us life, and this is a wonderful thing, and we should appreciate it. The manner in which you express your appreciation has got to depend on language, which Rambam believes is a matter of convention. It's got to, do you bow, or do you beat your breast, or there are lots of different ways of expressing different emotions and different attitudes. If somebody does you a favor, you should thank the person and not try to shame the person. That's true in every society. But how you say thank you and what it is to honor a person or shame a person, the Torah says stand up before a hoary head. That's another ethical commandment. Stand up before a hoary head. Well, maybe in some societies, standing up is a sign of respect. But the point is to show the respect. How you do it is a matter of convention. The objective moral truth is that if you owe somebody, you should show respect.
Got you. Great.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So for the next question, how do you understand the More Nevuchim cited in 316, 319, 320, and 321 in reference to God's knowledge, with the point of emphasis on the problem of God's knowledge and providence?
Wonderful. And of course, those 2 points, of course, God's knowledge and God's providence are intimately connected for the Rambam. He says that the philosophical school, which he both relies on and criticizes and wants to show where it's complementary to the Torah and where it's at odds with the Torah, he thinks that they made a grave mistake with regard to God's knowledge, and it was because of their view about providence. Specifically, the problem of evil led many people in the philosophical school of Neoplatonic Aristotelianism to deny that God knows particulars in this world. Why? Because they say that they saw that people could be very good people and have very unfortunate things happen to them. They get ill, they get punished, they get persecuted. Obviously, your fortunes in life do not depend, as we hope that they would and think that they should, on your deserts. And that's a serious problem. That's a problem that every philosopher has to deal with. And their way of dealing it, the philosophers at that school, who were the most important and thoughtful and worthwhile philosophers that the Rambam knew, they tended to try and solve that problem by saying, well, God doesn't know, it's beneath his notice. It's kind of like, as he uses the example of a man might not pay much attention to the comings and goings of the cats in his house.
He's not involved in the particulars.
What? Yeah. But he actually uses that example of the cats in your house. The cats come and go, they chase them out, and it's for somebody that's not the main thing on the householder's mind. And similarly, the God of the philosophers doesn't seem to know or care. Doesn't care. It's not that he doesn't care; he doesn't know. They don't want to say he doesn't have the power, but they say he doesn't know because particulars are, as you said, beneath his notice. There's several things that the Rambam does about that. The first thing that he does about the problem of evil is he agrees with the philosophers. I call them the philosophers with a capital P, meaning that school, not all philosophers. He agrees with them that matter is the basis of the problem. And the reason matter is the basis of the problem is that matter is the basis of your particularity and your individuality. Your soul might be part of a world of souls where it's connected with all the other souls, but your matter is what individuates you. You have your body and I have my body, and we have different diseases and different strengths and so forth. And matter. I mentioned the Satan. He identifies the Satan in the book of Job as an allegorical, symbolic representation of the idea of matter. Matter is two things. It is a gift, and it is a basis of our weakness. And part of the thing you have to recognize, and he gets this from the Neoplatonists, is that if it weren't for matter, there wouldn't be anything but God. God can't create another infinite and absolute being. There can't be a second God that's created by the first God. God creates by making something other than himself. That's an expression in Plato's terms of God's generosity. But in being other, it becomes finite. And that otherness is what matter amounts to. Matter is not just physical stuff, matter is otherness. And it has two different sides to it, depending on whether it's manageable or not. And he uses the story in the book of Proverbs to explain the difference. Everybody knows the famous passage in Proverbs 31, where the good wife is described and her price is above rubies and so forth. She's more precious, in other words. That's manageable matter. He doesn't think that it's just about women. He thinks it's an allegory of the relationship between matter and spirit, between form and matter. That's manageable matter. But in Proverbs 7, there's a description, there's a kind of dialogue where this woman is trying to entice this young man and bring him to her house, and she gives a lot of detail of description. He tells about that early on in the guide. And she represents matter. How so? Well, she's always looking for some new partner. That's what matter does in terms of the Aristotelian idea of matter and form. Matter is always, Aristotle says that matter is kind of feminine because it needs form to, which is the masculine principle, to get along. And it always changes. Matter is responsible for change, and change is responsible for weaknesses, for destruction. It's because of our matter, Rambam says, quoting Galen, that you're not going to live forever. Here's what he quotes from Galen, from a famous medical work of Galen. Galen is a 2nd century physician who was the doctor of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Galen said, don't expect that a being made out of semen and menstrual blood is going to last forever, or glow like the sun, or be able to do just anything. You've got weaknesses that are built into your identity by your embodiment. That's what matter is for. Proclus, the great 5th century philosopher, Neoplatonist, says that matter is a gift. It's really the first thing that comes from God, because it's that basic otherness. It's that basic expression of God's generosity that you're going to have something besides God. God doesn't just keep it all to himself. God is perfect in every way, but God wants there to be other things. God wants there to be, according to Maimonides, God wants there to be as much and as diverse reality as is possible. The world is so full of a number of things. I think we should all be happy as kings. That's not Proclus, that's Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. But you see, that principle of plenitude requires that there be finitude, and finitude requires that there be vulnerability. And vulnerability means we're not going to last forever as individuals. It means we're not going to be able to leap small buildings or even tall buildings or any buildings in a single bound. It's a condition of our existence. We should be grateful for it, but we should also manage and control it, which means controlling the appetites that matter requires us to serve and feed, and controlling the passions, including anger, one of the worst passions according to the Rambam, which is a defensive mechanism, right? But once your anger gets out of control, it becomes destructive of self and other. We have lots of examples of that around us, don't we? So the problem of evil is a thing that he has to deal with. Now, he doesn't think that evil predominates. Muslim philosopher and physician Razi, who lived in the 10th century. Razi thinks that evils predominate in our lives. And Rambam ridicules him. He says he wrote a book about theology. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's a terrible book. Maimonides has great respect for Razi as a physician. He was a great physician. But when he started talking about evils predominating in life, he was wrong. and he was misleading people, and he was falling into vulgar notions which are often expressed in songs and stories and so forth. Rambam says that. He's got a target there that he does not name, and in this case, his target was Saja, who also lived in the 10th century, died in 942. Saja also thought that evils predominate in this life, and Rambam thinks that that's very misleading. He doesn't name Saja there. He uses Razi as the kind of whipping boy that this view is so wrong. And he says some of our people who were influenced by Kalam, which is Muslim theology, said the same thing. He's referring to Saja. Saja was motivated to say that evils predominated in this life, partly because his experience had a lot of unpleasantness in it, partly because of things that happened to innocents who suffer, including Jews who suffer, partly because the Talmud is very concerned about the problem of evil, as all thinking people are. But also, Saja wanted to say that God is obligated to make it up to us in the next life. He wanted to use the thesis that evils predominate in this life in order to argue that God has a moral obligation to make it good in the hereafter, a theory of recompense. That's based in part on the Talmudic theory of the sufferings of love. The sufferings of love, Saja says, if you suffered and you check yourself and make sure you haven't been doing anything wrong, maybe then you're among those people who have been singled out by God for special grace that he's going to reward you disproportionately in the hereafter. And Rambam says that view is unbiblical and untrue. He understands the motivation for adopting it in the Talmud, but it's a striking case of Maimonides rejecting a Talmudic view. He rejects the rabbinic view that God will subject people to undeserved sufferings in order to reward them disproportionately in the hereafter. He says, it says in the Torah, all God's ways are justice, and therefore it can't be, it's unbiblical and untrue. Well, what's he going to do then about the problem of evil? The first thing he's going to do is deny that it predominates. And so he'll say that birth defects are rare, that war is not the universal condition, that fire and floods are not what's always happening. The basic thing, the thing always to rely on, is the underlying goodness of creation, the underlying generosity of God's providence over us. He does not think that suffering is the dominant view. And I will say a philosophical point that I have built partly on that basis is that if you think about the logic of the nature of evil, evil is always predicated on the destructiveness of what is good. In other words, the recognition that something is bad presupposes the concept is parasitic upon the recognition that something is good. There's always the good that's there first. If innocents suffer, you've got to look not just at the suffering, but the fact that there was innocence. The good is ontologically prior to the evil. And this is part of what the Torah thinks, as part of what Maimonides is building on the Torah. Now coming back to the question of knowledge, which is where you started from. He blames the philosophers for not making adequate use of their own conception of matter, and instead denying that God knows anything about particulars. How is he going to solve the problem about God's knowledge then? That was your original question. He motivated the philosopher's view by saying that they're motivated by trying to solve the problem of evil, exempting God from responsibility for the suffering of innocents. What he says is, first of all, that evil does not predominate. But second of all, as far as the knowledge of God, he reminds, and here he is very Aristotelian, he reminds the philosophers that universals by themselves don't exist. The only thing that exists are particulars. So if God's going to know anything at all, he's got to know particulars. That would naturally lead you to ask the question. Let me see if I'm anticipating what you're going to ask, Benzian. How does God know particulars? God, according to the way I read the Rambam, knows particulars by way of the universals. That is, you're an example of a human being. You're an example of a certain kind of human being. You've got certain characteristics, certain virtues, certain strengths and weaknesses, and God knows all of that. Universals per se do not exist. Maimonides on the question of universals is what they call a conceptualist. He's neither a nominalist nor a realist. That is, he doesn't believe that universals exist there in the sky all by themselves. They are God's idea through which God creates and by which God knows. So he doesn't need to have recourse to the denial that God knows particulars. He thinks God does know particulars by way of the universals. Now, sorry, go ahead. You were about to raise a point.
You sort of answered. I kind of wanted also just a little bit more of an elaboration on what that means, that there's no such thing as only universals.
Then what it means is that his Platonism is Neoplatonism. The idea was pioneered by Philo 1,000 years before Maimonides, and the basic idea is that those forms of things, as Plato called them,
Cutting out the form. He cuts out the forms.
Yeah, the forms exist as ideas in the mind of God. The way I like to put it to my students is that Philo solved the housing problem. And he also solved the problem of what does God do all day long. That's a vulgar way of saying it, but what it means is Aristotle's God knows only himself. Philo's God knows everything, but he knows it by way of the fact that Philo's God knows all those ideas. The ideas aren't floating up there in the nowhere. The ideas are God's ideas. They are ideas through which God created the world, through which God governs the world, through which providence is exercised. So our understanding and our virtues and so forth are expressions of, now Rambam doesn't know Philo directly, but he has the same spirit and the same technique. So the ideas that God consults in creating the world are God's ideas. They're expressions of God's wisdom. So God does know particulars, and universals by themselves don't exist, is exactly as Aristotle himself had argued. So he can do divine knowledge and divine providence, so the two are intimately connected in his mind, because what motivated the philosophers to deny God's knowledge in particulars was that they were unhappy about the fate and fortunes of individuals who don't always get what they deserve.